Okay, well, our second session today, I just talk a little bit about the flood and the fossil record. And again, there's some really good material available on this if you're more interested. But that's some of the questions that a lot of times we get asked about, or just a topic, again, where there's just tremendous evidence that we can put our faith in the Bible as God's inerrant word. And so before we jump into the more scientific aspects, there's a lot of things also associated with the flood that I think are very relevant. One of the ones is there are flood legends basically in every culture around the world. Okay, and so you think about that, well, how would that happen? So a lot of times people will try to spin it the other way. They'll say something like, well, maybe the Bible, just copied the flood account from this other group or this or that. And so there's ways you can go into it. You can say that the details in the Bible are very consistent with what happened, which obviously it would be. But just the fact how biblical explanation of that would be, well, because there was a global flood, and then that information is passed down, and then when people were scattered at the Tower of Babel, they went to different areas around the world, but they still knew about the flood. And so those legends get corrupted over time, but it's essentially I think a lot of people say it is every culture in the world knows that there was a global flood. So that in itself is very significant. So that's a good topic for discussion. Now, when we talk about flood geology, I think really the thinking on floods and what the effects of a flood could be, it really took off at Mount St. Helens. Of course, Mount St. Helens, I believe that was 1980, Mount St. Helens erupted. And there was a lot of things that happened at Mount St. Helens that people had been taught or had been thinking, and maybe it was just that they were being taught, for several decades that, that can only happen given, millions of years. And we were seeing it happening in hours. And so that in itself was significant. So that's one thing. If someone tries to say, well, I was on a mission trip in Peru once, and I had a person say, oh, well, hey, I just read that they found this rock, and it was in the South Pacific, and it takes millions of years to form. It can only form in millions of years. So how do you answer? Well, of course, you try to get more information. You say, well, we're in the South Pacific. Well, the article didn't really say. Well, what was the kind of rock? Well, it didn't give a lot of details, but they had this thrown out that, well, here was something that can only happen in millions of years, or but it's really just you look into it, and there's always you have to look at their assumptions, but it's essentially never true. And so again, this was a case that we learned at Mount St. Helens, that processes that people would say took just long periods of time, or just conditions that we couldn't even imagine, they were happening. And so that was kind of what started people thinking a lot about the flood. And so, but a global flood would be extremely catastrophic with extensive geologic changes and activity. Mount St. Helens, again, was actually a very small flood. The flooding that we had around Mount St. Helens, it was basically the volcano erupted, a lot of the ice caps, the glaciers melted, and that caused flooding. Really, they were having floods for weeks afterwards, but just some of those floods, again, they were carving canyons, 100 feet deep, just hours, laying down sediment very deep, again, just hours. And there's a really good DVD, I'll leave a copy here, it's called Is Genesis History? And it's very well done cinematographically. It was actually one of those movies where they released it on a Thursday night. I think it was in something like 1,000 theaters, sold out every single theater, and it was the top movie in the U.S. that particular night. So it's a good, and so, but they go into a lot more detail. But that's the whole point, is that was actually a small flood. And so a large flood, or even medium-sized floods, but large floods, just really tremendous effects. Another thing we have to think about is, the post-flood world is very different from the pre-flood world. There's evidence, and both secular and biblical scholars agree that there's at one point in history just a single continent, and so or single massive land. Well, those continents would have spread apart during the flood. Mountains would have formed after the flood. Rivers and the climate would have been significantly different because of the flood. If anyone ever asks, well, where's the Garden of Eden? Well, the correct answer is we don't know, because that was destroyed in the flood. Because a lot of times people say, hey, there's really no place on earth that matches a description of the Garden of Eden. Well, you wouldn't expect there to be, because that was changed during the flood. And so that particular location no longer exists. And so Mount St. Helens, again, small flood, channeled scablands, medium flood. Now, we do have evidence for a very large flood. Grand Canyon was a large flood. Global flood would have even stronger effects in the Grand Canyon, but we do have evidence of a massive worldwide die-off of marine life, which was partially evidence for the flood. Genesis 7:11, all the fountains of the great deep were broken up and the windows of heavens were opened. We see osmium and shale oil, and there's these very defined lines for that. Well, that's evidence of tremendous volcanic activity. And so when you talk about people trying to say, well, they'll say what caused the dinosaurs to become extinct. But one of the things they'll try to point to is these areas, in the strata where they'll say they have certain concentrations of either iridium or osmium. But we find layers with osmium, which is consistent with a tremendous amount of volcanic activity, which is a way that God could have caused the fountains of the great deep. If as the continents were splitting apart, the Earth's mantle was exposed, then that's a very consistent way, and it'd also be consistent with the evidence we see around us. Evidence of immersion of all land, Genesis 7:19 through 20, all the high hills under the whole heaven were covered. And of course, we do find marine fossils pretty much on every, high up in the mountains. The other evidence consistent with a global flood have fossil graveyards. And so I noticed, driving down here, a lot of the, and I used to live in New Mexico, so it wasn't shocking to me, but you'll be crossing over a bridge, and you'll look out, and it'll say, and it's totally dry, right? It's this dry creek bed, and it'll have like this level indicator and how high the water is and what the flood stage is. And so, but imagine when you get a torrential downpour, you have flooding. And if you ever look when a flood occurs, that a lot of times it'll go for long periods, long stretches of the river where there's really not a lot of debris deposited. And then at certain areas, a lot of times it's at a bend in the river or some other location, you have just all the debris tended to pile up. So anything that got swept into the river during that flood, it just tends to all pile up in certain locations. So that's what we see from a flood today, really small floods. Well, that's also what we see in the fossil record. You can go for hundreds of miles and essentially not find a fossil. And then you get to locations where the fossils are so, I guess I'll just say so thick, that you can't help but find one. And so there's a place in eastern Wyoming, my son and I were blessed to get to go out there. And literally hundreds of miles, thousands of miles, no fossils. We get to this spot and it's like, well, where should we dig? And they're like, oh, just anywhere. And so, sure enough, you're just digging, and we were finding hadrosaur fossils. We have some small piece of a hadrosaur bone named after us somewhere well, not named after us, it's numbered, but in some basement somewhere down in Texas now. But that was but again, it's fossil graveyards where you don't see fossils, and then all of a sudden they're just all piled together, very consistent with a global flood. You have folded rock layers with no fractures, and this is sedimentary rock, and so you can look in the Grand Canyon, many places, you'll have rock, it's the same layer, and it'll literally make this giant curve. And you can't imagine, how can that be laid down over millions of years? Because it's just this big curve. So what had to happen was it's all laid down very rapidly while that rock is still soft. It bends. In other words, it would be bent into that location, because you can take that rock, you can crumble it between your fingers, but you look at that bend, there's no cracks in it. So again, it had to be bent while it was still soft. And so again, you'll have a lot of what people call rescuing devices, and they'll say, well, maybe after that rock was laid down over millions of years, then it got really hot, and then somehow that it was as ductile it could bend. Well, if it had gotten really hot, it would no longer be sedimentary rock. It would have been metamorphic. And so again, but again, there's always a lot of times if you'll say something to somebody and it's an area they're interested in, they'll throw something back at you. Well, just, there's again, a lot of times it's pretty straightforward to answer it, but you might not be expecting it. So just a thought. No weathering and erosion between layers. Notice there's a lot of building going on out here. We had a place near my house in Alabama, and they had the park. They were basically preparing a site for those little, one of those little miniature shopping centers, not miniature, just a small shopping center. And they had, graded the land, and they were, packed it down, and they were getting ready to build it. Unfortunately, I think they went bankrupt. And so literally within months, what was just this really nice flat ground all ready to build on, well, it had, good sized bushes growing out of it. We'd had some rainstorms, so it was starting to erode. And, this was just within a matter of months. And so there was a lot of erosion on that particular, once flat surface. Well, again, if we look at strata, again, Grand Canyon is a great place to go to look at that. You look at strata that we see, well, there's no erosion. No, I guess you'd say small, just kind of small scale, plants growing through it, little, erosion from runoff during rainstorms. There's none between the layers. And so how could that layer supposedly have been laid down over thousands of years, and you didn't have any animals burrowing in it, you didn't have any plants growing in it, you didn't have any erosion at all? And so again, very consistent with the global flood where those layers would have been laid down very rapidly. We have rock layers that go clear across the continent. I mean, you can trace the same rock layer from the Grand Canyons that we see exposed in the Grand Canyons. You can trace those thousands of miles. So again, very consistent with the global flood. Very hard to explain any other way. Sand transported a great distance. There's a lot of evidence that you have sand transported from the Appalachian Mountains all the way to the western U.S. And so that's not a small scale process. That's not something that would normally happen. We mentioned about the marine fossils high above sea level, and abundance of fragile shell fossils also consistent with the global flood. So this is just some famous fossil graveyards. There's the Redwall limestone, Arizona, Nevada, 10,500 square miles, billions of extremely well-preserved chambered nautiloids. And so, but what's interesting, these are, you can go, it's like just a couple meters thick. There's layers, and you can see those again at the bottom of the Grand Canyon, where there's like thousands of fossils per cubic meter. So how did that happen? Well, again, it's not just, gradually forming over time. What you're having is, say, that particular habitat gets destroyed, which, of course, the habitats are going to be being destroyed as the flood progresses. And as those habitats are destroyed, the animals from that habitat would tend to also be destroyed and would be buried, again, in these fossil-type graveyards. And so that's a very local one. It's easy to see. The Green River Formation in Wyoming, 16,000 square miles, has all kinds of different fossils in that, all buried together. They got alligator, fish, birds, turtles, mammals, mollusks, all just kind of lumped together in that particular fossil graveyard. And then Fossil Bluff in Tasmania is also a famous one. This is an example of the curves in the bottom of the Grand Canyon. Again, just this, you can see the strata and the bend. And again, you can go up to that rock and it just crumbles between your fingers. But again, that's very small compared to some of the features, but it still shows the point. You have even things like the cross-bedding. And so again, this is the true science. You look at the cross-bedding that we see in the rock, and that's in the upper right. It's very consistent, the angle of the cross-bedding, with those rocks being formed underwater. Basically, those layers being deposited underwater, and completely inconsistent with those layers somehow being built up by like sand dunes or some other process above water. You have very well-preserved fossils. You have soft shell fossils. You think about those fossils have to be buried very quickly. If you've ever gone away on vacation and your pet goldfish dies while you're gone, you get home, it's not really fossilizing. Things decay very quickly if they're not buried and preserved very quickly. And so again, we see some very well-preserved fossils. Again, evidence of rapid burial. And so again, a lot of evidence is very consistent with the global flood. And so moving from the flood, then you think, well, does the flood provide a biblically and scientifically consistent explanation of the fossil record and certain geologic features? And so you really have two explanations for the fossil record. You have the atheistic evolution, and that's the idea that these fossils somehow formed over millions of years. The order of burial would be related to time. Older fossils would be buried deeper. They do admit there's no transitional forms. Every now and then there's always a handful that people are trying to say, well, maybe this is a transitional form. And so typically they'll say, well, it's just imperfections in the fossil record, or possibly what they call punctuated equilibrium, where things aren't evolving. All of a sudden they evolve really fast, and then they get stuck, because when something shows up in the fossil record, it essentially shows up fully formed, fully functional, very little change through all the strata, and then it goes away. So you think about that, that's very consistent with the order of burial being the order, the order in the fossil record being caused by the order of burial, the order of the habitat destruction, the order that some animals float when they drown, some sink. But you take all those factors in, that is consistent with seeing something show up fully formed and disappear essentially the same and unchanged, which is what we see in the fossil record. That's the biblical model. But this idea that you have evolution, but all of a sudden you don't see anything at all, and then it's fully formed, fully functional, and it stays about the same. It's just not consistent with this whole idea of evolution. And so biblical creation, again, fossils were formed primarily during the flood. The order of burial is related to the order that habitats were destroyed by the flood. Ability to flee rising floodwaters, other factors affected the burial. Of course, there's the lack of transitional forms because they never existed. That's why you're not seeing transitional forms. And of course, the quality of the fossils also indicate rapid burial and fossilization. So, and when we talk about transitional forms, and this is why there's always a handful that people will try to say, well, maybe this is a transitional form. And so just imagine that there were no dogs alive today, and all we were doing was we were digging up fossils of dogs. Okay, so you'd have two ways of interpreting those. In this particular case, we could say, well, maybe a beagle, maybe a Yorkie was trying to evolve into a German Shepherd. Okay, and so the beagle was the transitional form. And we could start pointing to things and saying, oh, okay, yeah, you see these similarities, and the beagle's a little different, and it's maybe a little bit bigger, but clearly the beagle is a Yorkie transitioning to a German Shepherd. So that would be promoting this idea of transitional forms, promoting this idea of evolution. Or we could also step back and say, well, we studied a little bit more, and we're thinking all three of those are dogs. Okay, and so of course that's the variation within a kind. And so usually what you'll have is when fossils are it's very subjective how they're interpreted. Someone finds a bone, and depending on what the prevailing theory is, they can say, well, that bone is showing this or this or this or this. But it's very, very subjective. And so when someone proposes a transitional form, this is what typically happens, is it turns out, no, it's just variation within a kind. Or a lot of times it turns out that they were trying to fit it into a certain area, and it just, they were just completely wrong. And so we'll talk about some good examples of that later on also. But that's so when someone says transitional form, a lot of times either they're looking at it wrong, or it's just variation within a kind. It's just essentially variation. This is quote. This is Dr. David Pilbeam. He's a paleoanthropologist at Yale University. Says, I'm also aware of the fact that at least in my own subject of paleoanthropology, theory heavily influenced by implicit ideas almost always dominates data. Ideas that are totally unrelated to actual fossils have dominated theory building, which in turn strongly influence the way fossils are interpreted. So he's really saying there is again, someone finds a fossil, and then they say, okay, here's the theory. We got like this theory that apes turned into humans. So they're going to try to take that fossil and fit it into this prevailing theory. And so one of the things we're finding out now is if you go back and you look at there's everything from they used to show these lineup of skulls or these lines. You go back and you look at those, and it's no, those are all either fully ape or fully human. There's no variation within a kind. Different kinds of apes. People have a lot of different physical characteristics. But if you go back and look at those, and people are starting to, then it's either something's either fully ape or fully human. There aren't transitional forms. And so, but what he's saying is the theory is what dominates. It's not that I found this skull and I found that skull, and then somehow objectively, it was. Some decision was made. It's no, the theory says that I've got to try to turn apes into humans, and so that's how things tend to be interpreted. And again, these individuals aren't. I wouldn't say not. I don't want to say they weren't Christians because I don't know, but they certainly weren't necessarily Christians, or they certainly weren't outspoken if they were. And so, but what's interesting, this is where I would say, say they were atheists. Well, you have atheists with scientific credentials that often speak as scientists. And so in that case, he's just speaking as a scientist. And so that's, so he's making some good points. This is Colin Patterson. He was a senior paleontologist at the British Museum of Natural History. He said, I fully agree with your comments on the lack of direct illustration of evolutionary transitions in my book. If I knew of any, fossil or living, I would certainly have included them. You suggest that an artist should be used to visualize such transformations, but where would he get the information from? I could not honestly provide it, and if I were to leave it to artistic license, would that not mislead the reader? So that's, again, a scientist speaking as a scientist. I really like his attitude. He's like, no, I'm not going to just make up transitional forms. Now, unfortunately, that's changed. This quote was from 1988. You go into a modern biology textbook now, and it will line up a fossil here and a fossil here, and they might literally have data here and data here, and they will say this turned into that, and they'll give about 10 artist renditions of what a transitional form could have looked like. Now, at least the ones I've seen to date, it's always down in the footnotes, small print at the bottom, and it will say, da-da-da is what we actually found, and this is what we, think, things might have looked like, and then this is what. So at least it's acknowledged on the page, but that's just happened in the last 30, 40 years where all of a sudden now it's very commonplace to just make up transitional forms. It's going to be harder and harder for people to realize what's real, what's actually been found, and what's just someone's imagination, with their imagination being applied in a way to try to show evolution. And so that'll be the competition. I think a fossil or a piece of bone is always going to be very subject to interpretation. But when you get into things like looking at DNA, things where you can really go in the lab and measure stuff, that will counteract that. So it'll be interesting. But I'd just say, if you know somebody and they say, "Oh, I was at the museum and I saw evidence that this turned into this," well, you're almost worth the trip to the museum, and just hopefully they at least mention what's an artist's rendition and what's something that was actually found. Get a little more information on it. This was just an example about how things are interpreted. This was a long time ago. I used the Ernst Haeckel example previously. This was about 100 years ago. It was a Nebraska man. But even then, amongst certain, I guess you say certain communities or certain, you'd say atheists or however you want to describe it, there's this big push to try to show that apes turned into humans. And so what they did is they found, this was Nebraska man, and they found a tooth. Okay, so they found this tooth, and of course it was in western Nebraska, so that's why he's Nebraska man. Well, sent it off to the American Museum of Natural History in New York, and is declared human by Dr. Henry F. Osborne. And so again, we think, okay, we're used to that kind of stuff now, but wait, 100 years ago, New York, the guy said, got his PhD, he's saying it's human. And so based on that tooth, generated just this whole culture almost of ape men and apes turning into humans and cavemen, and we've all seen the cartoons. And so, but again, we're talking about a tooth. So a single tooth is found, it's declared human. And so I really like the illustration in the upper right, because if you can see it, from that tooth, and again, we're talking about how things are subject to interpretation. Well, we know what Nebraska man looks like, right? He's in front, so that's from a single tooth. But we also know what weapon he used. You see the club in his left hand. We know what livestock he kept. You see the camels in the back right. And most amazingly, you even know what his wife looked like. Okay, and so again, so it's amazing what you can get from it. Well, this happens over and over again. The reason it only lasted from 1922 to 1927 was 1927 they found another tooth, but this time there were bones with it. So again, true science advances. True science, friend of the Christian. Ignorance is the friend of the atheist. Okay, and so the ignorance went away because they found another tooth, but this time it had bones with it. And it turned out Nebraska man was just an extinct wild pig. Okay, so it wasn't even human. But the problem was, for those 5 years, public's imagination. And so then everybody just knows there's ape men because we've been talking about it for 5 years, and people just forgot that their main evidence just went away. And so so they had this whole ape man craze going. It still goes a little bit today. And then the other irony was in 1925, that's when we had the Scopes trial. And so and the Scopes trial was basically, the way it was couched was, of course, just to get permission to teach the idea that apes turned into humans, and present it, and of course now it's turned completely, you're not allowed to teach anything but that. But that was the whole Scopes trial. So this, fake science, fake evidence, or just misinterpreted, however you want to call it, that would have had an influence during that time back in 1925. So even though it's a long time ago, it's still important. But stuff like this happens all the time today. Because again, go back and picture yourself in 1922 picking up the Illustrated London News, with all this exciting detail about Nebraska man. Yeah, I mean, it's or trying to talk to friends that are talking about that. It's hard. It'd be challenging. It'd be something we need to be very alert to. This was one. This was more recent. This was 1999 through 2000. There was this idea that dinosaurs turned into birds, and that's still out there. We know dinosaurs couldn't turn into birds, but this was actually National Geographic. This was their kind of their cover story. It's called Feathers for T-Rex, and what they'd done is they'd found a fossil. It was displayed in the National Geographic Explorer Hall from October 15th, 1999 to January 21, 2000. 110,000 people saw this fossil. And so a lot of them were children. If you're ever in D.C. and you're looking at museums, if you go during the school year, there's a lot of field trips. And a lot of museums out there. It's great they do the field trips, but there are a lot of children seeing this. But it was admitted to be a fraud in January 2000. What basically happened is now they were paying people to provide evidence that dinosaurs turned into birds. When you think about it, that's really poor science to start with. So they were paying people to provide something. Well, someone basically faked a fossil and they sold it to them. Apparently they'd sold some to Nature a few months earlier. They put this fossil on display. But the question is, of those 110,000 people, mostly children, this was all over the headlines. What fraction do you think realized it was fake? In other words, of those 110,000 people, and this was 20-something years ago, how many of those are walking around today saying, "Oh no, I saw proof that dinosaurs turned into birds. I saw that with my own eyes. I was on my third grade field trip." And so that's the danger you run into. Now this one was actually very well publicized. A lot of times you'll get a big splash, something that people are claiming is again somehow proving the Bible's wrong or proving evolution. This one was actually pretty well publicized that it was a fake. This was Storrs Olson. He was a curator of birds at the National Museum of Natural History. Said the idea of feathered dinosaurs and the theropod origin of birds is being actively promulgated by a cadre of zealous scientists acting in concert with certain editors at Nature and National Geographic, who themselves have become outspoken and highly biased proselytizers of the faith. And I think he's referring to this as faith, that somehow dinosaurs turned into birds. Truth and careful scientific weighing of evidence have been among the first casualties in their programs, which is now fast becoming one of the grander scientific hoaxes of our age. And then a lot of you are too young to remember cold fusion, but he said that's the paleontological equivalent of cold fusion. And so that was good. And then you even go a step further. This was actually front page of USA Today, which I was really impressed because a lot of times, of course, when National Geographic retracted it, they obviously didn't make that their cover story that, hey, we were wrong. But it did actually make USA Today. Says a bird fossil is hailed as a major find until red-faced scientists discover it was doctored, and so again, give some details. So this was pretty well publicized, but again, it still had an impact, because people still, some people still cling to that belief today. Now, if we go to true science, and this is the difference, so you have bone chips that can be interpreted, or you have every now and then you get a fossil that's faked. You'll have But if you can go back to true science, that's again where true science always confirms the Bible. So we say, okay, we're trying to turn a dinosaur into a bird. Well, what all do you have to do? Well, there's dozens of things that have to be done. But one of the things we could look at is just say, okay, I guess one of the things is we somehow have to turn a scale into a feather. Okay, and there's literally books out there that our children are encouraged to read that say, feathers are just modified, what do they call it? Modified versions of reptilian scales, or your modified reptilian scales. And so it's just as fact. Fifth grader excited about science, love nature, pick it up, and that's where feathers come from. They're just modified reptilian scales. Well, that's nonsense. We know that's not true. Scales are folds of skin. Feathers are complex structures with barbules and hooks. Feathers originate from follicles inside the skin, which is totally different from scales. Feathers require significant different genetic information. We talked about last session. Where's that information come from? No explanation for that. You can't even really, when you think about it, you can't really postulate, well, maybe something happened. Maybe the scale's turning into a feather. We know it can't happen, but okay, so let's run with that for a little while. Okay, how do you have a more fit form as you're transitioning your scales into feathers? In other words, have you ever seen an alligator that's got half scale, half feather? What's going to happen if he gets in a fight with another alligator? It's just, so you can't even really make up stuff, for how you would actually have this happen. And even feather proteins are biochemically different from skin and scale protein. So again, you go back to the true science. We know that this couldn't happen, but you try to, there's always a spin, maybe we think we might see evidence that there were feathers on this, or, you get this just very subjective kind of hand-wavy discussions associated with fossils. This is another example. This was Pakicetus, 1983 to 2001. Again, just think of the quote, go back to what Ernst Haeckel was saying about Monera. Think of how this is phrased. In time and in its morphology, Pakicetus is perfectly intermediate, a missing link between earlier land mammals and later full-fledged whales. So it's, it's just eloquently worded. Sounds very convincing. Well, it lasted for about 18 years. And so what you see on the lower left, that was what was found. Okay, so you find a skull. And it wasn't even a full skull. You see just the darker regions. That's the part of the skull that was actually formed. Okay? So on the lower left. Now, you look above that, obviously to the trained eye, the only animal that skull could fit in was what you see above. Which, boy, that sure looks like a land mammal trying to turn into a whale, right? It's got some land mammal stuff on it, but it's also underwater chasing, And so that was what was pushed for probably about 18 years. True science is a Christian's friend. Atheists rely on ignorance. And you look in the upper right, we found not just a skull, but we found bones with it. Okay, so again, same thing kind of what happened with Nebraska Man. So now you find bones with the skull. Well, you look at those bones in the upper right, well, that's a lot more representative of that land mammal in the lower left. In the lower right. So it's just a not, particularly striking land mammal, but nothing to do with land mammals turning into whales. But again, for 18 years, this was, well, you can read the quote. In its time and its morphology, Pakicetus is perfectly intermediate, and so, of course, it ended up being irrelevant. Now, but again, these things, they don't go away instantly. Monera, it took 50 years for that to go away. And so people will still say, well, maybe land mammals turned into whales. Or people, if you go to the Smithsonian Museum of Natural History, you're watching a movie, and it's been out for a while. So when it took the kids when they were really little, and it's literally, you're watching this movie, and it shows, essentially shows this land mammal go behind a rock, and it pops out the other side as a whale. Well, they both started laughing because they thought that's ridiculous, and they were absolutely right. But that's what again, that's what we teach to our children, or it's being taught to children in a lot of public venues. So you do have some frauds. This was Piltdown Man. The only thing, there's always going to be frauds, but the only thing that's unique about this one is this was, so someone had basically planted bones to try to make it look like, here's some evidence that apes turning into humans. And the only point on this one was, it was people in this particular field were so excited about trying to show that apes turned into humans that they ignored some very obvious evidence that this was a fraud. So this lasted from 1912 to 1953. It was cited as proof of evolution again. What had basically happened was you had 500-year-old human skulls matched with the jaw of a modern female orangutan. Okay, and so you try to you're trying to show human and ape features, but the apes have big canine teeth, and actually the teeth, you see the file marks on the teeth, and so a lot of times it's very hard for anybody to get access to these fossils. And as actually they say that the pulp chamber was exposed, they'd been filed down so far. So you're trying to make basically an orangutan jaw look like human, and you had to make some changes just to make it look anywhere close at all. So that's pretty obvious. So the whole point is, well, why did it take 41 years for people to admit it was a fraud? Well, again, it was given the answer that it was being used to promote an answer that they were at least hoping was true. And this whole idea that apes turned into humans. I had one in 2009. Oh, this was an encouraging one. This was Ida. And again, I'm not sure, this is a long time ago. A lot of you probably don't remember this, but it was hyped, at least where I was living. You turn on the radio, they were talking about there's this scientific discovery that's just going to change everything. It's how we view ourselves, how we view da-da-da-da-da. It was about 2 days of the hype. And then what they revealed at the end of it, was that fossil you see in the upper right. Okay, and so it was very underwhelming, and so people looked at that fossil and they're like, well, that doesn't really change my view of anything. But they were trying to say, oh, this is proof of evolution. It's basically a fossil of an extinct, I think it's an extinct lemur with an extra tooth comb. It's nothing significant, but it's. But anyway, so these are some of the press releases. It says, press release claiming, world-renowned scientists reveal a revolution in scientific find that will change everything. Of course, it was, really hyped. In this case, it was the History Channel was hyping it. American Museum of Natural History, same group that, called Nebraska Man's tooth human, even though it was a pig's tooth. The ABC News covered it. So again, a lot of hype, but it was actually opposed by other people in the mainstream media, and that's what was so encouraging. And so they actually said, "This is too over the top," and so they actually came out against it. And there was a quote here. It says, "Of the avalanche of," well, I guess it's you talk about pop band doing it, but it was anyway. It was debunked effectively. Time, CNN, and other secular organizations. And then I guess their quote was, "From the beginning, Ida's unveiling has been a master class in ballyhoo." But it doesn't always fail. This one pretty much failed. They tried to claim that this was going to show something that changed everything, but they failed on this one. But they don't always fail. So what we'll kind of finish up with in this session, and we'll spend a little bit of time on this, is right now, probably a lot of the, I guess you'd say, the fake science, or this idea that somehow apes turned into humans, it kind of centers around Lucy. And so Lucy is just an Australopithecine. But has anybody heard of Lucy? Do you ever get that still around? Okay, so a lot of people have. And so this picture, this was probably maybe 12, 15 years ago. And that's a picture of, or this article was, I should say. And at that time, what they were doing is they were trying to push this idea that apes turned into humans. And so whenever you would see a representation of Lucy or this Australopithecine, well, they'd always put human hands and human feet on the representation. Even though we had the fossils, we knew that wasn't accurate. And so this is one picture. This is a foot. And so one of the ways it was described is you'd go to a department store, old department store. They used to have mannequins, and so you go to the children's clothing section, and they'd have little mannequins of kids wearing whatever clothes they were trying to sell. And so what they would essentially were doing would be you take the mannequin of the child with the clothes, stick a bunch of hair on it, and then put an ape skull on top, and say, "Oh, this is Lucy." It had absolutely nothing to do with any of the fossils that we found, any of the actual evidence. So this is a quote. This is Dr. David Minton. He was at that time an associate professor of anatomy and neurobiology at Washington University. It says, "The usual artistic license in reconstructing the fleshly features of ape men from bones allows evolutionary bias enormous free reign. However, artists do not usually misrepresent the bones. This statue's feet and hands are simply wrong and mislead the public." Goes on, it says, Minton cites evolutionary sources which show that creatures in the species had hands and feet which were not at all like human hands and feet. Rather, they have long curved fingers and toes, even more so than apes today that live mostly in the trees. Okay, so what he's saying, and this, unfortunately, this is becoming more and more prevalent, is it's not just take the bones, take the evidence, and spin it as hard as we can to promote evolution. This is just flat out changing things, misrepresenting things. Says, Canadian schoolteacher David Buckner has weighed in on the debate by posting an internet challenge to this misleading statue. He says that if people visiting the exhibition were to see an accurate replica of Lucy in the trees with features typical of tree-dwelling primates, it would make them question the whole notion of human evolution. Lucy would be seen as just some sort of extinct ape. Bruce Carr, the zoo's director of education, has no plans to alter the exhibit. "We cannot be updating every exhibit based on every new piece of evidence," he says. "What we look at is the overall exhibit and the impression it creates. We think that the overall impression this exhibit creates is correct." Okay, so does that last sentence should really bother you? Because now all of a sudden you go into the museum, or you go wherever you happen to be, and it's not what the evidence is, what you're seeing. There's a good chance it's not factual, and what you're really seeing is what the religion of whoever directs that museum, whoever's the curator of exhibits. If they're an atheist trying to push the idea that apes turned into humans, hey, you're going to see an exhibit that's trying to convince you of that. And so it's just really sad, because you used to think, well, go into a museum and you'll see some great artifacts, and you'll get some objective discussion, and that's, at least in this area, it's becoming less and less true. And so that's, but that last quote should scare people. I'm actually surprised he was honest, and I shouldn't say surprised he's honest, I'm just surprised that he openly admitted that. We think that the overall impression this exhibit creates is correct. In other words, that's his opinion is, obviously apes turned into humans. So again, true science shows that Lucy's merely an extinct ape. That's a better representation of Lucy based on the bones, the feet. I mean, there's a lot of, they talk about artistic license. I mean, we don't really know how long Lucy's hair would have been. There's certain features you really do have to what color it was. And there's certain things that you have to I guess say, I won't say guess at, but you know, things that you make your own. But that's, you know, based on the bone structure, that's what Lucy would look like. So a really neat ape that's now extinct. The quote is, you know, Dr. Menton points out that if Lucy's feet were accurately shown, it would be obvious they could never fit into the famous Laetoli fossil footprints. These are exhibit A for evolutionary belief in upright walking by Lucy's kind, whereas in fact they are identical to barefoot humans. And these are just footprints. They were, you know, just using dating methods. And we'll talk a little bit about that in the afternoon. But just, you know, again, they're, you know, erroneously dated to be really, really old. And then they use that to say, well, they're too old for people to have made them, even though they're basically like you're almost footprints you'd expect to see if you're on the beach. You know, someone's been walking barefoot on it. So it says they must have been apes, and so therefore they got to, yeah, they try to fit them onto an ape. And so that's all he's pointing out there, is that they're just human footprints, but they try to, you know, fit those into apes. So it's kind of a different subject. And then again, another quote says, Professor Betsy Schumann, evolutionist expert at Menton's University, admits that the statue's feet probably are not accurate. But when asked whether the statue should be changed, she says, absolutely not. Well, yeah, you know, again, that's a, you know, you think about that response. I mean, well, if nothing else, and this is a little bit tongue-in-cheek, but, you know, if someone's doing something like this, like they're running a museum and someone says, hey, that exhibit is wrong, and they're asked, well, should we change that exhibit? Well, the obvious response would be yes, but we'll need some funding, you know, because, you know, it's a way to, you know, and that's fine, you know, and so then someone would come up with a funding, but to just say, well, we know it's wrong, but we're not going to change it. I mean, that's just really, I guess you'd say, really telling. Now, the situation, again, seems it's getting a little bit better. These were, took these pictures up at the Natural History Museum, Smithsonian, up in D.C., and but there's still some fake science going on. And so here, at least they point out a few things. It says the brown bones are cast of the parts of Lucy's skeleton that were excavated. The black bones represent missing parts. So you immediately notice that most of those bones are the black bones. Okay, so most of those were missing. And then it goes on, this is actually on their sign, it says they were filled in using mirror images of bones that were found, fossils from other individuals of Lucy's species, and knowledge of human anatomy. Okay, so just think about that. So what's the presupposition? Well, it's that Lucy's turning into a human. And there's a lot of discussion that the hip bones are, apparently they were intentionally altered to make it look like Lucy would have an easier time walking upright. And that's actually on, there's actually some specials that were made promoting Lucy back in the 90s that actually readily admit that they altered the hip bones. And so, but it's just kind of the knowledge of human anatomy. So say we were trying to reconstruct a fossil of a chicken, and we only had certain parts of that chicken, and then we were using our knowledge of pig anatomy to do that. Okay, how's it going to turn out? Well, it's going to look a lot more like a pig than your average chicken, you know, because that's, you know, and so that's basically what they're saying here is, okay, we know, you know, we know for sure that Lucy turned into a human, or Lucy's, you know, kind was, and so again, just so that's interesting. So the couple of things they admit there, first of all, the bones that were actually found are actually pretty rare, and you know, I'm not saying this was intentional, but you know, usually if you'd say that the darker gives the more the impression that that's the real part. Well, it says the black bones represent missing parts, you know, and then the lighter ones are the ones that were actually found. But anyway, that's just a observation. Then it says, this is new, and again, it's maybe a step in the right direction. It says Lucy's species had compact feet that supported the body's weight during upright walking. They're trying to, you know, again, the evidence is that upright walking wasn't typical, you know, just like modern apes. But then it does go ahead and say, but look at toe bones. They are longer and more curved than those of a modern human foot, more like those of tree-climbing apes. So, again, 15 years, situation improved. At least now they're admitting, hey, the toe bones are different. You know, again, more like tree-climbing apes. Okay, so that's kind of the newer part of the exhibit. But then it gets worse, okay? So you picture you go into this exhibit and you're walking through it, and you know it's, you know, very well done. I mean, hundreds of millions of dollars spent on these exhibits. But you know, the spotlight on the foot, and again, it's like the feet start to look more and more human as you go through the exhibit. But one of the things that was pointed out is look at the facial expression. Okay, so that's one of the artistic license ones, and so it's kind of, you can go into certain museums. If you ever get a chance to go up to the Creation Museum near Cincinnati. It's really worth the trip up there. And they have this whole, they basically take the same bones and they just show, within the bone structure, you can make an animal look any way you want to. Well, you start getting these, what they call like human facial expressions. So all of a sudden, so you have the animal starting to look more and more human, but it definitely has kind of a human facial expression. However you define that, you have to get an art major to tell me why, but that does start to look more and more human. Okay, so that's the next one. So you're starting to get kind of eased into this. Oh, okay, maybe Lucy did turn into human. Then it just goes downhill really quick. Okay, so this is the next panel you get to. Well, now you have the chimpanzee and the person. They're obviously the same. They just look a little different, but they're both thinking deep thoughts there. In the upper panel, and then if you can see that one in the middle. So now Lucy, you got the human hands, the human feet again. He or she's apparently looking across, asking someone else, like, are they going shopping this afternoon, or what are they going to have for dinner? And so it's all, so it's all this like now, okay, this big happy, okay, obviously Lucy's turning human. So that's kind of I won't say, I'm sure there's other museums, but that's, again, just what a lot of people are getting exposed to today. And the reason I mentioned that, so this was on a weekday, I think it was on a Monday during the school year. And you look around and there's just, the museum's just filled with families, and it's fantastic. I'm thinking the parents are having to take time off from work. They're pulling the kids, a lot of them really young kids. They want to get them to the museum. They're trying to teach them, but it's just sad. There's so much misinformation in this section of the museum. There's other parts, you go look at the Hope Diamond. The Hope Diamond is the Hope Diamond. Now, I can't remember, I don't think it talks about billions of years or anything in that particular exhibit. So there's a lot of good things in that museum. But this is a whole multi-$100 million exhibit dedicated to promoting evolution. And it's, and so it's just, you're just sad. You see the family, and a lot of places do that now. But this is, but anyway, just show you'll see at least, I think there's at least 5 children here, a lot of good families. So you can't, so it's just a difficult challenge. How do you tell somebody that, hey, step back and think about this? Because we're not going to compete on the graphics. You got to get them, interested in the actual DNA, interested in the assumptions, just interested in where did that genetic information come from. So it's challenging, but it's a real problem because, again, all those kids going through there, that's what they think that you see one in a stroller there, that's all they're going to grow up with if their families don't attend church, or if they don't get exposed to truth. There is a really good book, Truth Be Told. It's written for kids. There's a lot of good resources out there, but it's just getting them into the hands of people. So at least encourage people to actually think objectively about the subject. So then, keeping the goal in mind, Ephesians 4:14-15, as a result, we are no longer to be children, tossed here and there by waves and carried about by every wind of doctrine, by the trickery of men, by craftiness and deceitful scheming. But speaking the truth in love, we are to grow up in all aspects into Him who is the head, even Christ. And then again, just realize that the Bible's God's inerrant word, and so what the Bible says is true. So that concludes this session. I think we might have a couple of minutes, depends on how hungry everybody is. Any questions or comments of anything that we went through this morning? Yeah.
The fakery reminds me of a favorite book that I discovered when my children were young in the 80s, the Motel of the Mysteries.
Okay.
Where they found, it's a work of fiction, but they found a hotel that had been buried, and they go in and there's a burial chamber, and it was basically a man who was laying on the bed watching TV, and the other one was in the bathtub, and they talk about that there was the worship with the man and the God was the TV.
Okay.
And the bathtub, all
some truth to that, but I got you.
Erroneously from a site.
Because they interpret it.
And form it into what we think it should be.
Yeah, that's a great that's a great example. Let's go. Yeah.
I've heard the term settled science quite a bit. Things don't seem to be quite so settled as evolutionists might want you to think.
Oh, yeah. A lot of them, they realize that it's almost in their interest to not talk about it, because if they talk about it, people will start thinking about it. And so, again, go back to Ernst Haeckel. He was just right out in front publishing whole books about how he had proof, he'd observed it himself. There were other famous scientists that observed it, that there was these simple little drops of mucus that were life. And boy, these days, that's the last thing they want to talk about is life making itself. And so every now and then there will be a splash. There was one, someone was able to again, basically copy DNA from an existing bacteria, but they were able to make the copy, what they would call synthetically. In other words, they weren't having to just take it directly from life. So it was a big scientific, but they did try to make a lot of splash about how, we just, we made life and da-da-da-da-da. But you don't hear that very often because people push back on it and then they realize that that's it's everything. Yeah, when we talked about earlier, the degradation in the genome. I mean, when I was growing up, I used to, and maybe they still do it, kids' cartoon programs, it was always, whenever they go into the future a million years from now, my favorite one is always we would have these little bodies and these huge heads, because apparently that was what, evolution was going to just drive us to be like super smart, but that's not what we're seeing. We're seeing a loss of fitness. We're seeing genetic degradation. We're seeing that that's a big issue. And so they're going to stop talking about that. I think the way, it'll just be interesting to see where what techniques are going to be used to attack the bio. But in a lot of areas where true science can be applied, they don't want to talk about it because they know if they'll get people thinking, and if someone really starts thinking about it, they'll reject atheism, they'll reject evolution. Yeah. Oh yeah, exactly. Yeah, that's right. Yeah, because I think like right now they're getting like 18 inches of snow in Boston, and it's 25 degrees. So yeah, it's climate change, but that definitely isn't warming going on today for them at least. So it's like, yeah.
When you're talking about they find a tooth and then they build everything else, do they do that with dinosaurs to some extent, or?
Yeah, it's
They know what they ate, and they know all this stuff, and how did they know that?
Yeah, so a lot of that is, it's hard. I think it's like you say, it's the best guess, and so I'm trying to think of what would drive, if there's anything that would drive things a certain direction in that area. But yeah, a lot of it is guessing. So, and then the good objective scientists will say, well, here's what I think, and here's why, and here's the evidence, and then others will probably come back and say, well, yeah, but here's what else it could be. But I'm not sure what all the agendas might be within that area. One of the agendas related to dinosaurs, they're finding soft tissue in dinosaur fossils now, and so we know that soft tissue can't last more than a few thousand years. And so they're trying, and pretty much now every dinosaur bone that gets sectioned, they used to not even look for it. When I was growing up, it was like, you never could find anything that wasn't fossilized because it's 60 million years. I think when I was little, it was 50 million years old, and now it's 65 million years old, and I'm getting older, but I don't think I'm getting that. But anyway, it's so that's the one where they're doing everything they can to try to explain that away. But literally on that one, they just got to the point. It's kind of like what you were saying. They just got to the point where they say, well, we have no idea how that can be there, but we know, that those bones are this old, so we're not even gonna worry about it. And so it's kind of odd. So that's kind of maybe a little bit of an agenda going on, well, a lot of an agenda going on there, because they don't want to admit, because dinosaurs were buried in the flood. A lot of dinosaurs were buried during the flood, and then after the flood, you had a different climate. You had, they may have gotten aggressive. People might have actually been eating them. Their diet, would have been different because of the plants went extinct. So that's why you see, some reference to dinosaurs, culturally after the flood, and then they just go extinct.
But how would they know this dinosaur ate meat and this dinosaur only ate?
Yeah, and they don't. And I'll give them the credit for that. Is like now a lot of them are saying that T-Rex was probably just a scavenger because the arms were too short and it would have been too slow and the bones. But when I was growing up, man, the T-Rex that was the one you wanted to be. So it was like so yeah. But so you're right. Yeah, this seems like they're free to a little bit of freer to change their minds, or if that makes sense, or freer to just keep thinking about it, and even if they have something totally from, T-Rex was this predator that could chase down and eat anything. To T-Rex might have just been a scavenger. To T-Rex might have preferred to eat melons. You heard that? It's like they're still. It seems like they're still allowed to do that. Yeah.
And talking a lot about the public school culture, something that I see, of course, a lot in media and public school is kind of what the environmentalism, climate change, which of course we can take care of our environment.
Right.
But do you have any resources that you could suggest, or just quick words about the other side of climate change.
Okay. Yeah, there's a lot, a lot that could be said. It's I'm usually really careful. I was talking before class, so I get asked a lot, did we really land on the moon? Okay, and so especially in foreign countries, because a lot of the teachers, like in Central and South America, they actually were trained in Cuba. And so when they were being trained in Cuba, of course, everybody was being told it's just a hoax, because communists. So something like, I think 75% at one point in time of students in certain countries didn't think we'd ever land on the moon. It was just this big hoax. Okay, so you go down there and then someone says, well, did we really land on the moon? I'll say yes, and then they'll say, well, what are the evidences? And you talk about, well, we'll see 1 million people saw the Saturn V take off with their own eyes, and half the battle of getting to the moon and back was to get a rocket that big off the ground. And you can talk about the thousands of people that would have had to have been involved in any kind of a hoax on the moon landing. The Russians were actually able to track our spacecraft out of orbit. They had every incentive in the world to say they're faking it, but they didn't because they knew the data was there. So you have all this evidence. I used to do that, but then it started dawning on me that this person, I'm worried about their soul. I'm worried about what their eternity. And so I kind of backed off on that a little bit. And so then I would always try to change the subject back to just, talking about the gospel and how we know the Bible is God's inerrant word. So that's kind of a balance. So that said, I'd say in a public school when they start talking about global warming, because you can talk about global greening, be one thing, because that's what we're seeing now. Increased CO2, plants do better. We're actually seeing global greening. There's areas of the earth that used to be deserts that are now growing plants again. If the person believed in the Bible, you could point out, well, most of the carbon that we're releasing now was buried during the flood. So what we're going to likely do is maybe we'll return to a pre-flood climate. But see, a lot of those, again, it might accidentally divert the, and that'd be the worst we would do. It's going to divert. We also know that the Earth's extremely well buffered. That we're learning, and that's again because God designed it that way. But it's another way that sometimes people think about it is, there's always people. I can't remember who I was talking to. I think before the session, it was for whatever reason, humanity always has a crisis that we try to create, so we get the ego boost from saying, oh, we solved that crisis or that. Because in the late 70s, you remember, we were going into an ice age. We had a couple of really bad winters, and we were going into a global ice age, and then we apparently solved that crisis. We solved, and so it's so I know I'm kind of just going all over the map, but I'd say just in general, there's always going to be something like that. Right now, it's global warming. 10 years from now, it'll probably be something else. And so it's just you think of maybe have them think more of it as, how's this an opportunity to get someone to focus on eternity, to focus on things that are spiritual, just realizing that there's always going to be some physical issue, that we're, that's trying to get our attention, trying to get us to really focus on that. And so, because I telling someone else before, I had what I thought was great devotional about how the people that, the way they try to attack the Bible is the same way they try to attack the moon landing, and the response is the same. And then it dawned on me that a large, 10% or so of my audience didn't think we'd ever landed on the moon. And I'm like, well, I don't care if I convince them that we landed on the moon. That's not going to affect their eternity. And so not really answering the question, but there's a lot of things that you could say, but maybe. A lot of things that could be said, but the main one is just to try to somehow get the person focused back on eternity, get them almost off of that topic, because a lot of times it's just it dawned on me also, there was no way the 10% of the people in the room that had were convinced we didn't land on the moon, and it might have been 25% of the people. I was trying to be an optimist. There was nothing I was going to say that was going to convince them we landed on the moon. So I wasn't even. And so the same thing. If you get someone that's really staunch on any issue. It's really hard to change their mind, and so we have to make sure that it's worth changing their mind. And that again goes back to using our influence to try to encourage people to obey the gospel. So I'm sorry, that was a complete non-answer, but
It has become a religion of sorts.
Yeah.
For a lot of people.
Yeah.
You look at Greta, or whatever her name is, from she's become the symbol, global warming, whatever it is, fighting climate change and all that. People put so much resources and effort in. It's becomes a religion because it takes up all their time. It's idolatry.
Yeah.
Is what it is, and they do it with good intentions.
Right.
But it's such being misled, and it's such false information because if they were focused on spiritual things, they knew that God created an earth that was capable of supporting man.
Yeah.
And we need to take care of it. But at the same time, we can use all this false notion that we can control everything.
Yeah.
To the end that we become God.
Yep.
And that but it's idolatry.
Yeah. Oh yeah. Yeah. And it's really there will always be a false religion out there. That if we can just solve this problem, then we've and it's hard to talk about without again. When if someone saves someone else's physical life, that's amazingly important and very good, especially if that person hasn't become a Christian, because that gives them, but what they've really done is they've just given them a few more years or decades to make their decision about where they're going to spend eternity. Because I can't, nobody can save somebody from eternity except Christ, for eternity except Christ. And so it's kind of like what you're saying. I could say, I did this. If we solve global warming, we're going to save all these. The other issue that global warming is running into is there's actually places that, for whatever reason, are benefiting from the increased CO2 in the atmosphere because it greens up more. Maybe there's it's not. But anyway, that's an aside again. But even if we said, okay, if I can solve global warming, I'm going to save all these people's physical lives or make it better. We act like, we just, we cured all the world's problems, and that's not the case.
To your point, maybe the question to ask them is, that's great that you want to, save the world, save the planet, but what happens when you die?
Right, and what happens when those people that you're wanting to help die, and what happens, and that's,
What's after that?
Yeah.
And get them thinking about that, because a lot of them really think that's, after they die, there's nothing.
Yeah, and that's the one that, again, just goes back to me, the free will one should be something that's clear to people, but just the whole notion that that's based on that there's nothing, this idea that, wow, how did you turn in, just how to get people to really step back and think about, do they really believe that, or is that just something they're either parroting because that's what they've always been told, or it makes what they do on Earth seem that much more important. So in other words, if they think, I'm only going to be here, 70, 80, 90 years, and that's all that matters. So boy, I gotta, everything I'm doing here is really important. So maybe that gives them a greater sense of importance. But just kind of getting them, and so it's hard being immersed in the society when there's a false religion that predominates. But most societies throughout history have been that way. There's always a false religion that predominates. That was like the example last night with worshiping Baal and Asherah. It was false religions dominating. So. Yeah.
I don't need to be glib, but it sounds, based on the evidence, that it takes more faith to be an atheist than it does to be a Christian.
And it's the opposite too, because the Christian's faith is based on evidence, and that's what the Bible says. And now the atheism, they tried to start out pretending, we're scientific, so we're just thinking about science, we're going to go to the science. Everything, as science advances, it just is proving them wrong and wrong and wrong. And so, the life from non-life is an example. That's been just the last 150 years where we realize just how complicated life is. The whole idea of information in the genome being created by mutations and natural selection, that's being proven wrong. The idea that somehow the genome's improving, that's being proven wrong. Any way you look at it, we'll talk a little bit about the Big Bang in the next section. I mean, there's so much evidence against the Big Bang, but that one's still being clung to. So it's again, it's not just more faith. It's not even. It's like I'm gonna be an atheist no matter what the evidence. I don't care. I don't want to believe in God, which is, what we unfortunately you'll run into people like that. They know that can't be true. They know there's a God. They know the Bible's God's inerrant word, but for whatever reason, they just decide they're not going to believe it. I would use Fred Hoyle as the example there. Someone where, again, he knew life couldn't just make itself. And so he comes up with a theory that yes, fascinating. Oh, great, aliens put us here. Let's learn about the aliens, but it didn't answer the fundamental question regardless.
Ironic.
Yeah, it is. Yeah.
Was it Richard Dawkins
Yeah.
that had the, in the wheelchair?
No, Stephen Hawking. Yeah. Richard Dawkins. He's kind of one of the more, I'd say, eloquent, outspoken atheists. And so, but he'll make, like he used to talk about pseudogenes. We used to have this whole idea of junk DNA, and literally there'd be things that would happen, like he'd have major publications, and like I think it was like 3 years later, I think he had a publication in 2009. In 2012, there were, I think it was 32 publications by 30 different research institutes, basically saying there's no such thing as junk DNA. And so like, oh good, maybe he'll come back out and say, oh, I was wrong. Just keeps going with it. The junk DNA was really funny, because you look at what they're saying is, if you've ever had you guys did a lot of work building the building, but say you'd ever had I'll use a transmission as an example. Say you ever had the misfortune of trying to fix your own transmission. Well, it's something like that. Well, the first several pages of the manual are going to be the parts list, right? And then the rest of the manual is going to be how to put the parts together. And that's true for building bookshelves, anything like that. Well, what the atheists had pushed as junk DNA for so long, they were saying that, hey, only 2% of our genome's used for anything. Well, that was like essentially what you consider the parts list, okay? And then everything about how you go together physically, they were calling junk. And so you go back, 20, 30 years, and they'll say, oh, yeah, 98% of our DNA is junk. And so and so they're basically saying is, yeah, that whole manual on the transmission, just throw it away, just keep the parts list, because the rest of it's just junk. And so that was essentially what they were saying. So that's what these simultaneous publications, I think it was back in 2012, they said, no, the entire genome is useful, and we just don't understand it yet. And so and I love that. I mean, that's just, that's where when we say ignorance, that's not necessarily an insult. They're basically saying, hey, we don't understand it, which a way that usually that isn't first. That's just ignorance. It's like we don't know yet. But yeah, so he's a very staunch atheist.
The Stephen
Hawking, he passed away. Yeah.
How sad that was.
Yeah.
He's not an atheist anymore.
Yep. That's true. Yeah.